Axiom Verge has been one of my favourite games that has come out across any platform over the last 10 years. Quite easily too. It's been a game I've come back to constantly for enjoyment, for critical thinking in terms of its storyline and plot. It's just a generally fantastic experience that I think a lot of people don't give it credit for, or those only very particular give it credit for. It's definitely a really fascinating experience that has flown under the radar in the last 10 years. You can imagine my excitement then when Axiom Verge 2 was finally announced and the unbearable delays that I went through that only made me suffer even more from just wanting to play the next installment in the Axiom Verge universe. A universe that I absolutely adore and have loved every second postulating or speculating about the different natures and the open-endedness that the creator Thomas Happ created about Axiom Verge 1. With it being out for a year now and I've finally been able to play it myself and beat it, I'm really excited to share my viewpoint on Axiom Verge 2, but more so today from the perspective of Axiom Verge 1. There are things that were revealed in Axiom Verge 2 that I think make playing through the original Axiom Verge a worthwhile experience. Not that it's not a worthwhile experience anyway to play through Axiom Verge 1. But today what we're going to go through here is looking back through the story of Axiom Verge 1 and lending new perspectives or theories based on what we know about certain things from Axiom Verge 2. And we're going to go through what Axiom Verge 2 means now for Axiom Verge 1. So we're going to go through the story, first with the main game story first, and go through that and explain things along the way. Then we might look at the notes, the notes that are of interest now we've played Axiom Verge 2. And then we'll look maybe more as a whole at the backstory before the playable events of Axiom Verge 1. We're just going to look at all those little angles that Axiom Verge 2 just opened up a little bit more, and we'll go from there. Obviously, the first thing of note really to go through the intro cutscene of Axiom Verge is, of course, Dr. Hammond, who had a very small role in the original Axiom Verge, just point of view that she was Trace's assistant, helped Trace when he was crippled, and together helped him publish his new theory of everything. Dr. Hammond is a much more prominent character in the events of Axiom Verge 2, so nothing really to do with this cutscene at all, but just, knowing from this point forward, we know a lot more about Dr. Hammond and her work, and a lot of her work is obviously the sole focus of Axiom Verge 2. So it could be our main focus for today and in this particular video, but just interesting from the point of view of watching this again, how her role features then in Axiom Verge 2. And as Trace says, if he had died, well, let's just say everything would have been a lot different, and you can extend the same thing to Dr. Hammond in the same vein. Next main thing of interest is the first boss of Axiom Verge, which is called Sudra. Now, the big thing Axiom Verge 2 took away from this is the similarities, of course, between the humans that can become affected in Axiom Verge 2 and turn into a prototype version of this boss, Sudra. There's a lot to be said for the creation of these bosses through the effects of the pathogen and what that pathogen is and how it's created. We get a lot more insight in Axiom Verge 2 as to how this maybe came about. So I'm going to shelf the pathogen talk for now because it will come up again later, but just interesting that obviously the similarities, the shapes take between the humans that become infected in Axiom Verge 2 versus obviously the boss here from Axiom Verge 1. Obviously this is a lot bigger, so, but again, there's more to be said in a later cutscene about the pathogen and the bosses and how that come together. Next up really comes the power filter speech, or rather Elsa Nova's story time once Trace activates the power filter. Elsa Nova talks about the concept of the breach, what the planet that Trace is trapped on, being Sudra, and the idea of the breach and the world stream. And I guess in Axiom Verge 2 we learn a lot more about the world stream and Ansur, is that how you say it? I'm honestly not sure. Forgive me if I butcher the pronunciation of some of these, but so it gives us an insight maybe we more so looked at the breach, more so the breach obviously and the breach attractor are the main things of interest for you from Axiom Verge 1. We just know that the world stream was, I guess, the Athos' end goal, and in the meantime he had to eliminate the Sudrans to reach that end goal, to reach that world stream on the other side. So it's just interesting in Axiom Verge 2 that we learn a bit more about, I guess, what's more past those gatekeepers, so to speak. We learn about Ansur and the technology there. Obviously, Elsinore talks about the concept of the breach attractor. There's a much more portable version of the breach attractor in Axiom Verge 2, but it's very unclear as its role in Axiom Verge in terms of the portable version. Was it something that the Sudrans always had a breach attractor and this is just a more portable version of it? Is it a case where the Sudrans didn't have the breach attractor and then this portable version became available to them and they utilized it into a larger, more mobile station? Maybe seems unlikely given that the whole idea of Sudra was to keep the breach in check, so possibly, the portable version came after the static version. That would be my guess, just because this whole thing, Sudra is meant to keep the breach in check. Also supposed to keep things out of the world stream, so to speak, and that's the whole idea of the breach as well. So there is that to be said. There's also that to be said of Ophelia, which Elsinore refers to as her quote sister. Could just be a lost in translation kind of thing, because obviously English is not Elsinova's first language. Of course, they would speak in the Vika, the language of the Rasalki or the Kililtu, as the Sudrans refer to them as. So that much is unclear. Sister might be, in quotations here, might be I guess, easier for Trace to understand rather than anything else. She talks about how Ophelia found Trace. There's plenty to be said about Ophelia and finding the pattern mind, so to speak. But yeah, so this cutscene is one of the more important ones in the original Axiom Verge anyways, but there's a little bit more, we know a little bit more about, I guess, the world stream and what is beyond the breach. And of course, having gone through the breach somewhat in Axiom Verge 2, you kind of see that a little bit more of the breach and what it can maybe do and what's hidden there. But yeah, this cutscene is pretty important in Axiom Verge 1, and a little more context to it now, having played Axiom Verge 2. Next up really comes the conversation between Trace and Elsinova when they meet Veruska for the first time, who is in need of repair, and talking about these supercomputers, basically, as Trace puts it. And this is when Elsinova talks about Rasalki. Our word is Rasalki. Is it like water machine? The whole idea of the Rasalki as a species is unclear, but it did look as though in Axiom Verge 2, in the emergence, where we know Drushka is obsessed about evolution and driving basically evolution forward, and how her lifetimes essentially, or other people's lifetimes, humans' lifetimes, are too short to perceive evolution, which is what she says their main goal is. We see her apparently maybe doing some work with maybe something looks like a primitive Rusalka. There was that whole settlement with Hammond Core about the 6 submarines, and so whether what we see in Axiom Verge 2 is actually the beginning of how a Rusalka is made or something like it is unclear, but it certainly seems, it's the most Rusalka-like thing we see in Axiom Verge 2. And given Elsinova's explanation of water machine with what we see in Axiom Verge 2, perhaps there's some correlation there between the two. Maybe that's how this whole idea of the Rusalki or the water machines were originally made, was in Drushka's tank, so to speak. It's unclear as to the origin of the Rusalki, but certainly it looked like that Drushka has the capabilities to make something similar to what the Rasaki either are or straight up made the Rasaki. So it's unclear on the timeline where the Rasaki come into things and their origins, and if they were just from another place and they ended up on Sudra afterwards, or it's hard to say exactly what the Rasaki are and where they came from. But if we were to take Elsinore, now look, we know that Elsinore in particular lies to Trace a lot. So I used to interpret it as they're actually just war machines, but I guess they need to break it in gently for Trace in Axiom Verge 1. Maybe there's something more to truth now to Water Machine based on what we've seen from Axiom Verge 2. Again, it's not clear, but it's enough to postulate what they're making in Axiom Verge 2 in the Emergence, and how similar you could view it to a Rusalka. And if it does fall into the line of a water machine, it certainly seems like those things seem to line up, but it's not completely clear. Another point of speculation you could have about the Rusalka is Axiom Verge 2 explores the whole idea of contingency plans that were never needed in terms of their weaponry, and we see that through what the Lamassu calls the Siuna. Again, apologies if I'm not saying that correctly, but the Lamassu, one of the things that is covered in the notes with the Lamassu, or mentions of the Lamassu, is how basically they taught the people of Kiengir, again, apologies I'm not saying that right, about fighting the Udugs, or the Udugs, again, pronunciation, sorry. So you could maybe look at the Rusalka as maybe something along similar to those lines. There's something that were maybe built to, maybe not on Kiengir itself, but maybe some other planet in the stream, or so to speak, or in the filter, or wherever the case may be. Maybe maybe the Rusalka you could see maybe as another contingency plan to deal with outsiders or interlopers, which is something that Axiom Verge 2 covers a lot. So it's not, again, nothing concrete or definitive, but just another theory as to if the Rusalki didn't come from here, where else could they have come from? Where else could they have originated from? Is it a case of just Drushka made them, or could Drushka just make something similar to them, or are the Rusalki themselves weapons that were created maybe by the Lamassu or whoever is behind the Lamassu? Because it's not clear what the Lamassu is as a whole, or like where are they? Do they receive their divination or their ability to make super weapons or whatever from the gods? Is there someone behind that? It's unclear, but you could maybe look at the Rusalka in one or two of those vectors, so to speak. You can also maybe look at the Rusalka as something that maybe Drushka saw inspiration for. So, for example, the Emergence itself, I think it's strongly implied is basically maybe the door before Sudra, so to speak. The environments are very, very similar. The enemies there are actually what you would fight in Axiom Verge 1. The color palettes are very, very similar. It seems like that the Emergence is like maybe the hallway, so to speak, to Sudra itself, and that will explain Drushka's involvement both maybe in Axiom Verge 1 and Axiom Verge 2, is that the Emergence is like a corridor, so to speak. Maybe she already saw and met the Rusalki in Sudra. Again, it's unclear in what point of the timeline this is in Sudra. Is it before the High Priestess rung in the storm to bring the Rusalka down into the care of the priesthood? Is it the Rusalki were cleared to soar or fight or whatever in the sky ocean above Sudra before the High Priestess rung in the Storm Talisman, which is the breach, which forced them to spill onto the plains as it was put in Axiom Verge 1? Did Drushka get a close-up look at the Rusalka, maybe have a look at their bodies, and then deduce to me how to create them in her chamber or tank, so to speak? Again, nothing concrete, nothing definitive, but just another angle to look at something Axiom Verge 2 has brought up that we can look at a little bit differently now. Some things, some loose ends, or some lingering questions from Axiom Verge 1. I kind of got carried away there on that last Rusalka tangent, but next up in Axiom Verge's 1 story is the aftermath of the boss fight of Gertab, where obviously Gertab shows a bit more personality, a bit more resilience, or resistance rather, to actually fight Trace. And this is when Elsinova talks about what the bosses actually are, which is they were humans that have been exposed to the pathogen. And obviously this goes back to the Sudra / prototype Sudra and the humans that were infected in Axiom Verge 2, and how they became the bosses. So it's a clear, there's something going on between how they become the bosses versus what the bosses are in Axiom Verge 1. So in Axiom Verge 2, obviously the thing that forces or thing that makes or helps the humans become infected and turn into Proto-Sudra is essentially it's when you pick up the arm Damu, who of course is the drone, and you enter the breach. Now it's unclear, it seems like the pathogen is some sort of combination between Damu as an arm and maybe exposure to the breach or something that's in the breach. It's unclear as to what it actually is that forces or makes the humans that it comes into contact with turn into the Proto-Sudras. But it's obviously very similar to the process mentioned with Elsinova talking about the pathogen and how Athatos created these variants using the pathogen. So it's very unclear as to what or how he got to this point. So what is it? Just Damu himself? Is it because he's a kid and he can't quite control his power? His stated power is to turn something into something else. He talks about how the ability to turn things into giant monsters or a giant. Something giant, bigger than basically the arm that he was. Is that his stated goal? Is to turn people into, or is that rather what he was created to do? Is to turn people into larger mutations than what they were? How does that fit into things? So this whole concept of what the pathogen is, and it certainly seems that if you have like a triangle, it certainly seems like the pathogen, the bosses, the humans. You have the top triangle being the bosses, the bottom two angles of the triangle are obviously the humans and the pathogen. So you put pathogen with the humans, which we see in Axiom Verge 2, how that actually works and how it how the process of actually turning and how you get to your boss, your Proto-Sudra. So it doesn't seem like Athatos actually created the pathogen. The effect of what he's going for essentially is there somewhere. Obviously, it had a different effect on the Sudrans than it did on the humans. Did Athatos know that? Did he just know it would be poisonous enough if it was poisonous enough to kill humans or turn humans? Would it kill the Sudrans? Did he know? He surely must have known that what he was doing with the Sudrans wouldn't happen with the humans, because if he'd just done what he'd done with the humans to the Sudrans, then he's got an entire populace of essentially Proto-Sudras that could just basically either wander around and fire upon them essentially. So it seems like whatever it is Athatos discovered about Damu and how his effects create the pathogen or harness something similar to the pathogen. Again, it's there's a lot to speculate as to Athatos' role in creating the pathogen and what he did to maybe weaponize it, to test it on a Sudran or something, and then maybe knowing or not knowing how it would work on Sudrans, released it upon the planet. Again, there's a lot going on here with Damu and the pathogen and the breach, and it's not clear where things fall. I don't think the breach itself is what's to cause the pathogen, because again, Sudra is a planet that's created to keep things in check. It obviously has the breach attractor to pull the breach down. So assuming, that the breach attractor is activated, the population didn't just die because of the breach. It's something to do with Damu himself. Again, what it is that he does, or, mostly unknowingly, because, Damu is everything we see in Axiom Verge 2 is a good kid. He's just obviously, he's been through some messed up things, sure. Weaponized as a child. It's not messed up at all. But it seems like he unknowingly or whatever, that he doesn't mean to. He can't control what it is that he does. So when maybe it's the combination with in contact with the breach or in tandem with the breach, maybe his power, again, however Athetos manifested it or weaponized it, created it into what we know the pathogen to be in Axiom Verge 1, which basically, was used for mass genocide, and in this case, in Athetos version, to make the variants, the bosses. So there's a lot to be said here in terms of the pathogen itself and what it is and where it comes from and why. But it all seems to be connected to maybe the combination of the breach and Damu. It seems mostly to be Damu. I would maybe say less so the breach, because the breach is also harmful to Indra in Axiom Verge 2 until you get Damu. So, and the breach, going into the breach itself, it clearly doesn't seem to have an effect on the people of Kiengir, or the breach itself doesn't have because given how closely connected the breach is to Kiengir, and you've got these breach holes or pockets that you can just go through with Damu. Given how it's the relationship between the two, it seems like, the population of Kiengir didn't just drop dead from the breach. So it seems like Damu himself is a contributor to what would eventually become the pathogen. It has this effect on humans, it has a different effect on the Sudrans. So at what point Athetos learns what Damu is and what it is he does, maybe he came to contact with humans and then, with Damu's power, or, Damu was with them, or whatever it was, or something similar to Damu, whatever was the case, it resulted in Trace, or Athetos rather, being able to weaponize whatever side effects that Damu unknowingly, seemingly, is projecting, and Athetos was able to weaponize that to create the genocide that he needed to, because he needed to wipe out the Sudrans to get to the port, essentially. Because obviously you've met with resistance along the way, because the Sudrans didn't understand their technology anymore, and they saw it as taboo, and they saw it with religious reverence. So there are others that speculate that maybe the Rusalka created the pathogen out of, I guess, wanting revenge on the Sudrans for imprisoning them, essentially. I more so see the Athetos vector of things, is that he needed to kill the Sudrans to at some point get to the lost technology. And it's also talked about in Axiom Verge 2 that the concept of time passage in the breach is incredibly slow. Very slow, sometimes like a quarter or 100th of the time. And we know for a fact that Athetos spent time in the breach, and he can, because he's a pattern mind, so he can do that. Unlike Indra in Axiom Verge 2, who you could only go through the breach in Axiom Verge 2 as Damu. So, but we know pattern minds can traverse terrain or environments that are more dangerous to more humans, and I guess that's mentioned not just at the end of Axiom Verge 2, but obviously it's referred to in Axiom Verge 1 as the clone copy of Trace goes through Sudra. He doesn't just drop dead, or he doesn't turn into a Protoss Eater himself as exposed to the pathogen. He could survive. It seems that he could survive longer under the pathogen's effects than normal humans, because he's a pattern mind. Again, what a pattern mind is, it's still not quite clear, but he can survive terrain that normal people can't. So, and we know, because maybe he spent decades maybe in the breach, and that's just maybe normal human decades, which is a quarter of the speed in the breach itself. So he could have spent decades in the breach and very slowly lost his mind. By the time he comes out of the breach to Sudra, or whatever the case is, whatever pocket he found on Earth to get to Sudra, or going upstream, he went through the breach upstream, and maybe that's where he found the greatest port, and that Sudra was the gate that was in the way. He maybe just slowly lost his mind, became insane, and became the Athetos that we know now, because obviously there's a stark difference between the kind of Athetos that the Rusalki gambled on working for them, versus the Athetos that obviously is the final boss in Axiom Verge 1. So again, a lot to be said about the pathogen itself and how Athetos weaponized it and used it, but there's a lot more to be said now about the pathogen in Axiom Verge, given what we know from Axiom Verge 2, and obviously how much of a role it plays in Axiom Verge 1 and its backstory. So yeah, again, a lot of speculation. There's a lot to be said for it. There's a lot to postulate from it, but the pathogen is something we've got a little bit more of an idea, or at least a little bit more we could speculate with. But there's obviously still a lot to be said about it, and there's still a lot to be there's still a lot that's very ambiguous about the pathogen that is in Axiom Verge 1. Next comes the cutscene with Ophelia after she fixes Trace from the effects of the pathogen. Now, there's a lot to be said here. It's extremely strongly implied that Indra is indeed Ophelia. The faces are very, very similar. The hair is very, very similar. The hair, I guess, whatever you could call it. So at what point Indra, who ditches her original name because her original body died, so it is not clear what name she takes up at the end of Axiom Verge 2, but it seems clear that there's an affiliation between her and the work of Shakespeare. She's in notes, it's been said that she's a fan of Shakespeare, and she drowns similarly to Ophelia, or comes close to it, as Ophelia does in Shakespeare, at least in the start of Axiom Verge 2. So it seems very, 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 very likely, if not basically a given, that Indra becomes Ophelia through her new form. So at what point Ophelia becomes a Rusalka, it seems unclear. I always thought, because the outsider in Axiom Verge in terms of the notes, I always thought referred to Elsinova. But given that Ophelia is the only one whose name is in Slavic, her positioning, I guess, is different than some of the other Rusalka. There's questions of what strain that she is. So it seems I now realise that the outsider referred to Axiom Verge 1 is Ophelia, and this is why, because she's not. And it comes back to Drushka's ability to maybe make or create Rusalki, or make machines that are very similar to them, because they don't know what quite she is. It's clear that somewhere along the way between Axiom Verge 2 and Axiom Verge 1, that Indra / Ophelia becomes a Rusalka from her normal human body. But at what point and how is this possible? Does Drushka's method of evolution make it so? Anyways, regardless, it does seem like Indra becomes Ophelia, becomes a Rusalka, her body, massive compared to what it is obviously in Axiom Verge 2. So yeah, there's a lot to be said about that. Also talks about how Ophelia brought Trace to Sudra. They use a device called a scry, which Indra would have learned about reading a note of Hammond. Hammond tried to find Trace using a scry, but wasn't able to find the device in time to find Trace, which is what her exploits later in life were all about, to try and relink with Trace. So she wasn't able to do that. It also is clear that at the end of Axiom Verge 2, she's looking for a pattern mind to help her get to lost technology that would help Damu become a human again, or something similar to a human, whatever he was before he was made into an arm for the Udug War in Axiom Verge 2. So it's become clear. It's still clear though that in the hundreds of years or whatever it's passed between Axiom Verge 1 and Axiom Verge 2, that Ophelia, it's not clear if she doesn't find her pattern mind until now, and by then there's a different end goal in mind because they're all trapped on Sudra, because of the breach tractor and the pathogen. But also that she still doesn't know what exactly a pattern mind is, because in Axiom Verge 1 she hoped that Trace would tell her why he is a pattern mind, and of course this Trace has no idea why he's a pattern mind. So that's an interesting little bite there, that she doesn't quite know what a pattern mind is, even after all this time, depending on what she's gone through, whatever it is she's gone through to get from A to B in terms of a human body to a Rusalka. So a lot to be said about that. You'd have to imagine, obviously, Drushka is involved, just to what degree and what it actually took, who actually knows. The only extra bit we get on pattern minds in Axiom Verge 2 is the note, "Beware the pattern mind." It says, "We must flee. Wielders, if you've not done so, hide your arms. Those few that can, cross the storms. It is said that the pattern minds derive their power directly from Ansur. Our only hope now is that we can survive long enough to regroup another day." So, again, it seems unclear. Maybe that's incorrect, so to speak, because the first trace that imprinted himself onto the egg in Sudra was clearly already a pattern mind. So it doesn't seem to be a case where he went up when he first healed himself. He didn't obviously go up the stream immediately, up the filter, and he did, like, maybe he did reach Answer, but he didn't reach Answer to become a pattern mind. It seemed like he was already a pattern mind when he first stepped into the chamber. So again, so it's still unclear as to what a pattern mind actually is and how you become one. Is it something you're born with? It's really unclear. But I would say the understanding in universe in Axiom Verge 2 of a pattern mind maybe is more so folk and legend, because we know in Axiom Verge 1 that the playable trace is a pattern mind, and it's made over. That is a copy made over from a past imprint and the nano gates that they use from killing Katra Haska. So yeah, it's still unclear as to what the pattern mind actually is. Next up at Axiom Verge is the aborted clone scene. It's revealed here that Athetos makes his clones in these eggs, in these chambers. And it's the same in Axiom Verge 2, how they made their soldiers in a similar way as well. They cloned their soldiers in a similar way in Axiom Verge 2. So I guess this is one of the things that the Rusalka didn't really lie about. They did obviously withhold a lot of other things and lie about some other stuff, but they did, in essence, make their clones or their soldiers in the same way in Axiom Verge 1 and 2 here as well. Also talks about Athetos and how much time he spent in the breach. Again, we talked about it a little bit this earlier, more so, but again, it's mentioned that time passes very slowly in the breach. Again, sometimes too, it's not quite the same passage of time. It seems to change. Sometimes it's a quarter speed, and it was referred to and the same note as 100 of the speed. So again, it just shows how much time did Athetos actually spend in the breach, and was it human decades, or was it decades in the breach, and in human terms that could be easily hundreds of years, and maybe that's how he was able to live as long as he did. Or did he lose his mind along the way in the breach as well, with how slowly time flowed? And it's unclear, but it certainly seems that Athetos' time in the breach would have been agonizing, given how slowly time moves in the breach. And you could maybe pinpoint this as the area where he began to go slowly insane, and maybe the things that he was not willing to compromise prior to going up the stream and into the breach. His main point of emphasis being that he thought that the technology was too dangerous. The original Trace thought the technology was too dangerous to be brought back to Earth. Maybe his time in the breach, which may have been hundreds of years possibly in real life terms, naturally, made its dent on his insanity, or his sanity in that case. But he was there for a very long time, and they're talking that they don't know what happened there. You can only imagine what kind of things he must have gone through, but yeah. Next comes up linking up with Elsinova in her full body state. She mentions here that she can't go into the breach, but it's mentioned earlier that Ophelia can go into the breach. And so this probably gives another indication that they're not the same species, they're just similar, the Rusalki in this case. So again, most Rusalki can't fly into the breach, but Ophelia did. And this may have more so to do with the fact that she could traverse, that she's not the same, she's not a conventional Rusalka, so to speak. So while others can't go into the breach, she can. And maybe it was a form of her Rusalka body, came as an amalgamation between Damu the drone and Ophelia's head, so to speak, or Indra's head. So it seems clear that she can go into the breach and survive, but the other proper Rusalki can't. So maybe it comes back to her origins and how the Rusalki themselves are a separate species, and they came about to be in some other way, but Ophelia, engineered likely by Drushka, they work differently. Their bodies work differently. They're similar, but not the same. Finally, in the main story comes the main conversation with Athatos, where he makes a clear differentiation between the pathogen and the breach. So coming back to the pathogen earlier, and what it is it the breach? Is it Damu? Is it an amalgamation of the two? Athatos seems to suggest that they're different things. They're not the same thing. Now, it is possible that there are things Athatos didn't say to protect Trace, because he did mention that if he tells Trace too much, the Rosalki will kill him. But he does seem to make a differentiation between the pathogen and the breach. So people speculate where the breach is the pathogen. I don't personally think it is. I just think they're two different things. Maybe the pathogen, in combination with the breach being brought down lower to the earth, is what created the effect that it did. Because the other question would be, like, how does Athatos release the pathogen across the entire world? Like, presumably he's just in one section of it. How does he release it across the entire world? It could just be that in combination with the pathogen he created, the effect of the breach was what actually polluted the world and spread the pathogen. That seems to be the likely, at least to me, that seems to be the likely scenario, is because it's not just one or the other. It seems like the combination of the two is what created the effect, and the combination of the two is what seems to create the effect of the humans turning into the proto-Zeders in Axiom Verge 2. Is that combination possibly of the breach and whatever it is Damu is, or whatever he unknowingly emits when he comes into contact with humans or Sudrans, or whatever the case is. So that seems to be, it just seems to be the differentiation between the pathogen and the breach as being two separate things, not the same thing. And of course, he's in the breach attractor. He is also susceptible to the pathogen himself. He's obviously he's in the machine that prevents his demise for the time being, and his portable device was destroyed. But he's in the breach, so to speak. So the breach is not really killing him. Again, going back to that whole thing. The breach didn't kill everyone in Kiengir, and it didn't kill everyone in Sudra itself when the breach was initially brought down. So it just seems to be that in combination with the pathogen, that seems to be what basically poisoned or killed everyone else. That basically covers the story from Axiom Verge 1, and the things Axiom Verge 2 seem to open up a little bit more in the main story. But there's also the story through the notes, which basically covers the backstory of the entire game, the events prior to the playable events of Axiom Verge 1. And there's lots of things to be said here as well from the point of Axiom Verge 2 and what it shows and what it reveals. So they're more so loose ends than anything else. I think the main massive takeaways from Axiom Verge 2 is the fact that Indra becomes Ophelia, and wherever it is Damu is became the basis of what the pathogen is. Or it shows us that the combination of whatever Damu is and the breach, the combination of the two, is what created the pathogen, or a version of the pathogen that Athatos again successfully weaponized to, effectively create genocide for Sudra. So I think those are the main takeaways. Everything else is, they're little bits and bobs here and there, and that's what these notes are as well. Starting with this journal page, which this is a note from Axiom Verge 1. I'm reading from that. It calls itself Zeder. I don't know how I know this, but I do. Strange that such a thing would have a language. Stranger still that it would have a personal identity. I'm not sure how long I can last. I lose more and more each passing day. Sound is a deafening throb. Sight is a kaleidoscopic fire. Smell and taste open up entire worlds of terror. The worst is touch, a tingling, writhing, itching mass. It is expanding, supplanting. There won't be anything left to save when it's done. Now, I believe this in Axiom Verge 1, you could, what does that mean? Hard to say. I think from Axiom Verge 2, it's the process of turning human into the proto-Zeder. And this is something that is horrifyingly illustrated in Axiom Verge 2 as the actual process of turning human into into proto-Zeder. You can see the blobs and the masses that it's describing here. I think that's what this is. It's the process of turning human, turning human into the proto-Zeders. And speculation of it calls itself Zeder. When it says it calls itself Zeder, I don't know how I know this, but I do. Maybe that's just something that becomes part of you when you begin this process. You don't know how you know, but you know what you're turning into. It's a thin argument, I understand, but I generally think that this process is the process of turning from human into Zeder, which is basically the process of a human going through the effects of the pathogen. And all the people you infect in Axiom Verge 2, they become very sick. I imagine this sickness is what they go through. That an expanding mass, itching mass, supplanting. There won't be anything left to say when it's done. And when it's done, I assume is the process of that turning process. So I think this journal page it goes through the process of humans turning into Zeder when exposed to the pathogen. That would be my guess on that. This next note I'm going to be reading from is the security notice. It says, the intruder who commandeered the Storm Talisman is suspected of releasing a plague. Attempts to negotiate with the intruder have failed, as have the use of a force. Evacuation has been thwarted by the storm itself. Until we understand this affliction, we are requesting that people remain in their homes and keep away from public areas. Now, I suspect, obviously, the intruder obviously is Athetos. The use of the word commandeered, the Storm Talisman, commandeer, to me more so means obviously you take over it. So it already is there. We were talking earlier about, the portable breach tractor versus the static breach tractor in Axiom Verge 1. So I suspect that it's already existed there for quite some time, the breach tractor, and this is not something that Athetos found and then created or set up. The breach tractor, he commandeered, he took over it. That's my understanding from that. So I guess that just clears that up in case of, how did the breach tractor come to be? Was it something that, Athetos became in control of the portable breach tractor, and then he built the one that we know in Axiom Verge 1, and the main objective is to disable. So I think it just goes back to the fact that the Sudrans has the original breach tractor for a long, long time, and maybe a portable version of it was made for pocket breaches or something similar that they could explore through, rather than bring down the breach as a whole, as the whole design of, or the whole objective of Sudra was to keep the breach in check, and they can bring it all down to an atmospheric level. I think those are two different things. So just a little one there to make note of, just that he commandeered it rather than, I guess, established it. So that's just something small. Next is the Outsider, which I always thought was Elsinova, but now obviously I know that it's Ophelia. And the Outsider reads, I'm so tired of her schemes. If not for her, we wouldn't be in this predicament, and now this ridiculous plan. Aside from Drushka's obvious interest in her, we have no indication she's even telling the truth. We don't even know where she's from, or even what strain she is. She seems to have greater capabilities than she admits. Should I have let you kill her when I had the chance? I do not know what is right anymore. And basically, this note obviously was hard to put together in Axiom Verge 1 because we didn't know A, who the note was talking about, and B, Drushka and what Drushka is, or who Drushka is. Now, of course, we know not just who Drushka is. Drushka was a human who, as at the end of Axiom Verge 2 illustrates, is extremely interested in evolution, and we see that Drushka's body is twice as tall as it was when Indra first met her in Axiom Verge 2. So it's entirely possible that Drushka became maybe a Rusalka, as well. But we also talked about Drushka's obvious interest in Indra / Ophelia. And of course, we know that these two have a collaboration at the end of Axiom Verge 2 to go to answer or to find tech that would be not just in Indrid's interest, but also she had to pitch this to Drushka as well. So obviously Drushka has a lot to get out of this too, which means Drushka has a lot to get out of the relationship with Ophelia. So it makes sense why Drushka is so interested in Ophelia, but as for the rest of the Rusalka, they've no idea where she is from and what strain she is, which makes me think that, again, the Rusalki existed themselves separately, and Drushka was able to create something similar to the Rusalki, and they didn't know what exactly Ophelia was, what kind of type of machine she was, or where she was from. They do speculate at her capabilities, which makes sense of given her that she was a wielder and she could wield these different arms, which obviously gives her a lot of different powers. It's not quite certain what extent those powers extend to in her Rusalka form, but she certainly has abilities that certainly the Rusalki are aware of that are very different to what she seems to admit they are. So again, just extra context of the outsider, who it really is, and obviously the nature of the relationship between Drushka and the Rusalki and Ophelia. Because it seems to suggest that the Rusalka seem to trust Drushka, or have a trusting nature of whatever Drushka is, or whatever Drushka became in Axiom Verge. So it's unclear as to what form Drushka takes, but the Rusalka seem to trust Drushka for whatever that's worth. The faded note is more so just to highlight the similarities that Hammond would eventually share with Trace. They both end up agreeing eventually, not together of course, because Trace's first initial thought is this technology is too dangerous to bring back to Earth. It seems like Hammond didn't quite agree at first, but as the decades went on, Hammond ended up agreeing with Trace that the weaponry, the technology was too dangerous to bring back to Earth. So just shows that eventually they reached the same point of agreement. Nothing much to mention here, really. It's just interesting that obviously this is something they both end up realizing at some stage or another, is that, yeah, this technology is too dangerous to bring back. Even though Hammond, I think, certainly seemed to utilize some of it, or her knowledge of some of it back on Earth with her technology that she ended up using through the Antarctic and through Kiengir. But obviously a lot of that never made it back. Some of it made it back to Earth, it seems, with the zero latency computing. Others did not. There are many wistful, reminiscent notes in Ikerma, but one of them is the anonymous quote. And it says, "It must not be forgotten the legacy of Sudra. In those far remote days, it was a time of war, of battle between angry demons and angry men, when roaring storms of fire and darkness were cast like stones between combatants." This could be reference to the Udug War. Udugs are basically, it's a reference to basically a demon, and the note about the storm bombs, which seem to resemble what is described as storms of fire and darkness cast like stones between combatants. The note about the storm bombs in Axiom Verge 2 says the Udug come from beneath the waves of a great flood. Their powers allow them to enter our world through storms of fire that appear in the sky. Until now, the Udug have seemed almost casual about the danger these storms pose to us of flesh and blood. They are doorways and nothing more to them. But yesterday a storm erupted with such violence it was seen to wipe out an entire village. I fear we may have been too successful in our deployment of the wielders. Where the Udug once brushed us aside like flies, they are now hunting us like boar. We must find a way to fight back. But it feels like, it talks about until the ocean was torn asunder, the last crop turned to dust, the last brick of the last home shattered, the last warrior and the last demon lie dying. The people understood their sin. So the arms of the apocalypse were sealed. This strongly suggests, given that we know about the apocalypse urns and all that kind of the nature of the arms of Axiom Verge 2, it seems possibly there was a similar war on Sudra, like the Udug War. But says the arms of the apocalypse were sealed, the massive patterns were castrated, the old machines returned to slumber. So obviously this mentions the arms, the pattern mines, and the old machines. all things we've seen in Axiom Verge 1 and 2. Less so the Arms of the Apocalypse, because obviously how they refer to it in Axiom Verge 2, yeah, we didn't know that in Axiom Verge 1. But yeah, so that this makes a bit more sense. This, in all this coach, the Arms of the Apocalypse, we kind of know what that is now. So it seems to be describing something very similar to the Udug War, and like that note in Axiom Verge 2 also seems to suggest. It seems to have a very similar effect, like the effect of the storms of fire. Seems very similar to what the storm bombs actually seem to create, or something the Udug used to enter their world, so to speak, or to, I guess, summon themselves or teleport, or whatever the case may be, that made warfare with the Udug so complicated and tricky that the people of Kiengir had such a difficult time actually dealing with, until the Lamassu actually helped them with their means to their end. So yeah, interesting note, obviously, normally, but a little bit more context seems to be added to it. You can give rise to speculation as to what maybe that war was. If it was the Udug War, seems unlikely given that was on Kiengir and the other one's on Sudra. But maybe, it could be a planet, Sudra could have been a planet that could have been maybe plundered from another. So maybe they had similar designs for what lay beyond Sudra. Possibly, it's there's a lot you could speculate from it, but yeah, it seems to be a little bit more explained what the Arms of the Apocalypse actually are, knowing what we know from Axiom Verge 2, and the effect, possibly, of the storm bombs. Something else that may connect Sudra to the Udugs is this transcription note, a conversation with A3. Talal obviously is the second boss of the game, being warrior in Sumerian, I believe. But when A9, which could be another variant, could be Athatos, asks what he is doing here, he replies Udug Hol. And when A9 asks what Udug Hol means, we don't get a proper answer of what Udug Hol means. But it doesn't seem to be, there seems to be very few coincidences in Axiom Verge, so I imagine Udug Hol maybe is some reference to the Udugs. In what capacity, it's unclear. But again, just a few things that seem to link up between Axiom Verge 1 and Axiom Verge 2. This note made very little sense in Axiom Verge 1, and it doesn't make a lot more sense in Axiom Verge 2. But at least it seems like there's some crossover between the variants and the Udugs. Maybe how Athatos got his variants and bosses to look differently to the Zeder. Maybe some were Udug. It's unclear if they had the similar effects under the pathogen, or just Athatos was able to utilize it to make it look like something different. Again, it's not quite clear as to what Udug Hol means, but now we know that the Udugs were a race of something, or of demons, or whatever it was. Again, it acknowledges its existence, but doesn't do much to tell us what it actually is. So again, one of many instances in Axiom Verge where you're left with more questions than answers, it seems. And that mostly covers it, I believe. Again, there's a lot of things that I probably missed connecting Axiom 1 and Axiom Verge 2, but yeah, I've really enjoyed putting it together, trying to think it through, and trying to attempt. I don't work, if you can tell, I don't work with a script here. I have a loose points, and I try and work off of that. So yeah, my thoughts are fairly scattered on this topic. I've tried to condense it as best as I could where possible, but it is fascinating to think about, and it's one of the reasons why I love Axiom Verge 1. Like, again, it can be frustrating not knowing the answers to certain things, and there are things you're left to speculate with. There's a lot of things that are very confusing in this universe, and for at least for my mind, at least, I'm not gonna pretend. I'm not gonna pretend to be more than what I am. If there are some things people understand better than others. Some of these things do go over my head a little bit, but I've tried to, I guess, theorize or speculate as best I can what certain things are, I guess. But it has been a lot of fun to think about and theorize and break down certain things that Axiom Verge 2 is opened up for Axiom Verge 1, because there's a lot that Axiom Verge 2 introduced. Like, forget its own story and Indra and the wielders and the arms and the Lamassu and all that. That can be left for another video itself. But I really want to explore Axiom Verge 1 through the lens of what we learned through Axiom Verge 2, and certainly a lot of things seem to have been answered. There are some things that have just as many questions as before, like the original Axiom Verge ending, for example. But yeah, I really enjoyed going through Axiom Verge 1 through the lens of Axiom Verge 2, and the things that opened up. We learned more about Ophelia and how really it's Indra. The pathogen is something that is definitely worth exploring. I hope they do explore. If we do get an Axiom Verge 3, I hope we do explore a bit more what the pathogen is. Maybe we like to learn a bit more about Athos himself. I assume we'll learn more about the world stream and the tree, so to speak, and Answer. We get some answers, perhaps. Haha, fucking so funny. But yeah, it's been fun. Apologies for my absolute inane rambling that has meant this is basically an hour long. But I hope you're able to get something from it, because there's a lot to break down. There's a lot going on in these universes and these games, which is part of the reason why I love them. I'm sure part of the reason other people love them. There's not a lot of love for these kind of videos in terms of, I don't see a lot of videos out there trying to break down some of these occurrences in Axiom Verge 1 and 2. So I've done a very poor job. Go if you want better analysis in written form. I recommend r/Axiom Verge. It's probably the most active, I think, of the communities that is like YouTube and Twitter, etc. Of what trying to explain stuff on Axiom Verge, because it'll do a lot better job than I did at this. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed, and yeah, thanks very much for watching.